So I wanted to start today's talk with a little riddle, but I think you'll know the answer to this. What's one thing that we're always losing, we feel we never have enough of, and that runs thin? Any guesses? Patience, right? So today's talk is about patience. But first, let's talk about impatience. When does impatience arise? Right. Let's say, like in this little cartoon here, this lady standing in line, trying to, behind this lady who's trying to wrangle her kid. Right. I want to learn to live in the moment. Just not this moment, some other moment, like a moment on the beach, maybe with Sonia in paradise over there. Right. So when does impatience arise? Impatience arises when we want life to be different than it is at this moment. When our expectations do not match with the reality, and we're unable to accept that reality, whatever that is for us at that moment. I really love this quote from Pema Chodron. And she's talking about how we relate to the experiences in our lives. And she says, according to the Buddhist teachings, difficulty is inevitable in human life. For one thing, we cannot escape the reality of death. But there are also the realities of aging, of illness, of not getting what we want, and of getting what we don't want. These kind of difficulties are facts of life. Even if you were the Buddha himself, if you were a fully enlightened person, you would experience death, illness, aging, and sorrow at losing what you love. All of these things would happen to you. If you got burned or cut, it would hurt. But the Buddhist teachings also say this is not really what causes us misery in our lives. What causes misery is always trying to get away from the facts of life, always trying to avoid pain and seek happiness. This sense of ours that there could be lasting security and happiness available to us if we could only do the right thing. So when we cannot accept these facts, whatever is appearing at the moment, we feel impatience, among other emotions. So what is patience? In Pali, the language of the Buddha's time, we find the word khanti. And there's many different aspects of this word, which include patience, endurance, forbearance, and forbearance being the ability to control oneself, to not resent when being attacked by others. This could be physically or verbally. And also the aspect of forgiveness. And I wanted to share two quotes, which I love, about this kind of patience, which in the Theravada tradition, we often associate, khanti or patience with a kind of gentleness, kindness, compassion, and strength. So this first quote is by Ajahn Suchito, and he says, "Pure patience is the kind of acceptance that acknowledges the presence of something without adding anything to it or covering it up." And then Gil Fronsdale shares that it is the willingness to see deeply, without resistance, the truth of the moment and the truth of the deepest levels of reality. So we can see in this definition that there is a sense of allowing something. But let's just talk a little bit about what patience is not. Often when we think of patience, it's maybe not that pure patience that we just saw in that definition. We might call it a superficial patience, or a fake patience even. So what patience is not is, when we have to grin and bear it, right? When we have to put up with something with a sense of self-denial and bitterness. And it's definitely not suppression, right? Because that's really a resistance, and a response of shutting it down. So the Buddha taught a lot about patience, right? It's actually one of the 10 noble qualities of an enlightened being, the paramis. And patience doesn't come first in the list, but actually towards the middle, being the sixth, right after developing other qualities, because it's not easy to have patience, but comes with practicing generosity, practicing self-restraint. So we practice all these things, and then we can fully practice and cultivate patience. And in one of the teachings, the Buddha suggests how someone can practice being patient. And he says that they can be resilient to cold, heat, hunger, and thirst, to the touch of flies, mosquitoes, wind, sun, and reptiles, to ill-spoken, unwelcome words and bodily feelings that when they arise are painful, piercing, disagreeable, displeasing, and menacing to life. So we can kind of see in this teaching, broadly speaking, 3 areas where we can practice patience. And I'm sure we can find others to practice from. But some 3 major areas include having patience when we are harmed or insulted by others, right? And, also when we experience hardships in life. Hardships can include these environmental factors that the Buddha mentioned, about the mosquitoes, about heat or cold, right? This winter in New York City, for example. It can also refer to the challenges that come up in our lives. And then we can practice patience with impermanence, the general ups and downs of life. We often talk about this in the context of 8 worldly winds, which is situations that all of us experience as living beings, of gain and loss, of fame and obscurity, of pleasure and pain, and of praise and criticism. Right? So these are always happening, these ups and downs. And it's having patience with especially the downs, right? It's easier to handle the ups, but with the ups, knowing that there will be downs and having that patience with that. And also impermanence in the sense of, pain from an aging or sick body, right? That the Buddha mentioned. So a reaction to an unpleasant situation with irritation, upsetness, or anger, often serves to make an already unpleasant situation worse. When we're angry and upset, we are the ones that actually suffer first and perhaps more. This feeling of upsetness can stay with us for many hours, days, months, and for some things, many years. My dad would always say to me whenever I was upset or angry at something, or at someone, he would always say, "Ah, that's their problem, right? You don't have to make it your problem. When you're angry, you make it, it becomes your problem. So leave that problem with them." So learning to cultivate patience is a way of taking care of oneself and taking care of others. We also consider it to be an antidote to anger. And the Buddha talks about this in his teachings. He says, "It is indeed a fault for one who returns anger for anger. Not giving anger for anger, one wins a double victory. He behaves for the good of both himself and the other person. Knowing well the other's anger, he is mindful and remains calm. In this way, he is healing both himself and the other person." So why patience? It might feel good to respond in that moment with frustration, but perhaps responding in frustration might have some negative consequences, right? We know that when someone responds to us with impatience, we often don't take that as well. So practicing patience gives us the opportunity to pause. We need patience to create a pause between that very moment we feel the agitation and anger arise, and the moment we have that impulse to yell at someone. Right. So Viktor E. Frankl has this beautiful quote, and he says, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." There's freedom in being able to choose how we respond to things. So, how can we cultivate patience? The first step with all of this is to identify exactly what we're feeling at this moment. And that might not be easy, right? But we can ask ourselves a few questions. When a moment, like a challenging moment or a moment of frustration comes up, we can ask ourselves first, what am I feeling right now? What is going on within me? What is actually happening here? So we notice what arises and we see if we can identify that feeling. Bringing an awareness to that felt bodily experience. If it's anger, see if we notice that experience of anger in the body. If it's a feeling of unease, notice how that unease might be manifesting as different sensations in the body. Are we breathing harder or breathing more shallowly? Do we feel a little bit warmer or hot? This felt sense. And here we focus on how we're experiencing the event instead of getting caught up in the annoyance of it. And this is actually a way of grounding ourselves to our personal experience in the present moment. And it moves our attention from the external situation to an internal one. And what this allows for is a space, that pause for us to examine before responding. So this investigation of the body's experience is, the first foundation of mindfulness. Second, to cultivate patience, we can acknowledge the unpleasantness. So we start by understanding our current condition, whether that's of discomfort, irritation, sense of unsatisfactoriness, of suffering, of dukkha, the word in Pali. So at the core of our suffering is our not wanting emotional pain. Right? Our suffering, our mental turmoil comes from resisting unpleasant feelings or emotional pain. So can we acknowledge this discomfort or unpleasantness without resisting it? Can we be with this uncomfortable experience without expecting it to go away? So this is very challenging, right? Because our tendency is to push it away and to, deal with it, get rid of it. We often operate with attitudes and assumptions that things should go our way, that life should be comfortable, that bodies shouldn't experience pain, and that society should be fair and peaceful. And yet we know from personal experience, this very often does not play out that way. It's often not the case. So first is accepting this unpleasantness as what is actually happening right now. And to be able to act more wisely, and we first acknowledge and accept, okay, this is how it currently is. I did what I could, and yet this is unpleasant. But okay, that's what it is. And trying to be with it without reacting with negative emotions that continue to affect our own well-being, and those around us. We invite in that gentleness and that kindness to this unpleasantness. There's a Buddhist teacher, same one in that first quote, Ajahn Suchito, who said, "It shouldn't be like this, but it is. And we have to support each other." And speaking of support, we can surround ourselves with patient people and learn from their example, see how they maintain patience in trying situations. So we don't have to go about it alone. You know, we can also see patience as an action, right? Often when we talk about acceptance of a situation, a common response is that, well, if we don't do anything about it, we're being a doormat. We're just being passive and indifferent. However, the thing about patience is that it's actually an action, right? It doesn't mean that we're not doing anything. Our not immediately reacting through anger and frustration is an act, and actually a noble act, where we don't contribute greater harm by insulting or raging back. That's why it's considered one of the noblest qualities of an enlightened being. You know, so sometimes we might think that by being patient, we're asked to take a back seat to injustices that need to be fixed. And we might think that being patient means letting those injustices go. However, the acceptance that comes from patience is really an acknowledgement of the situation as it is, the messy, complicated, harmful aspects, and the conditions in which all of these injustices grow. And once we have a wiser view of this current reality, we'll have the clarity of mind to investigate it for what it is and see what's actually in our control and not. And seeing what are the steps we need to prioritize in order to ultimately resolve that suffering, if possible. But the very first step is to not react with rage or despair or creating a story or a narrative behind that initial experience, right? From one thought, you end up with 100 thoughts, right? That tend to cloud our view of the situation. So one thing that we can do when we find ourselves in an impatient situation is to examine whether there is potential for action. Ask ourselves, is there anything I can do to change the situation without making it worse for myself or others? More often than not, though, when we ask that question, the answer might be no. And in those cases, one practice is to see if there's something pleasant or interesting that we can focus on at that moment while being with the unpleasant situation. We're not rejecting the unpleasantness of the situation, but redirecting our attention and seeing if we can find something pleasant or interesting to focus on. Right? We don't have to focus on the unpleasantness, but see if there's maybe, okay, as you're waiting in line, like what can make me feel better or happy in this moment, aside from the line going faster, right? And so finding that good, whatever it is, and look for the small things. So also, it can be very helpful to know the causes and conditions that are likely to lead us to losing our patience. So get to know our own personal triggers and warning signs. Right? What stressors tend to contribute to my impatience? If I find myself in this situation, I know I'm likely going to be impatient or be tested. And get to know the warning signs. Right? What do we start doing? And how are we feeling before we get to 10, right? From 0 to 10, there's different stages in between before we actually get to 10 and explode. We might be feeling restlessness in the body. We're checking the clock. We're fidgeting with the phone, maybe. Maybe in the body, we're furrowing the brow, the lips are, pressing shut, and we see a frown forming. Maybe looking around, we're huffing and puffing, tapping the feet. These are all different warning signs that are telling us, okay, I'm feeling impatient now. So when we recognize these triggers and warning signs early on, we can, at that moment, start to calmly remind ourselves to pause and practice patience. And we can even role play, right? If we know that these are potential triggers, we can play around and see how we could maybe more skillfully respond with different likely scenarios of impatience. And so it can be easier to handle situations when we've come a little bit more mentally prepared and we're not caught off guard. And then we lose it by impulse. But with all of this, if we continue to practice generosity, we continue to practice ethical conduct and avoiding harm, continue to practice meditation, developing concentration, stillness, and calmness of mind, and that mindful awareness. All of this will help us to become more generous, more open-hearted, and develop a heart of goodwill towards others. And all of this form the conditions for patience through the development of wisdom and compassion. So there's a Greek proverb that says, 1 minute of patience is 10 years of peace. So this is an invitation to find our patience by starting small, slowing down, and taking it easy. And then with all of this, we will be rewarded with equanimity, the ability to be happy no matter what the circumstances externally, the ability to be happy with ourselves and others with a compassionate heart and goodwill towards everyone, even in the most trying circumstances. So hopefully this can be of help to help us practice patience in our lives, but we'll just take it bit by bit. And with this, I'd love to hand it off to whoever will help moderate the questions.
That's